Are family ties unbreakable? Think again. When James receives a mysterious package, he is forced to confront the brother he swore never to speak to again. But will James be able to face the painful memories and rebuild what has been lost? You won't believe how this ordinary man's life is turned upside down and the surprising lesson it holds for us all. Get ready for a revelation that challenges everything you thought you knew about forgiveness. Welcome. Enjoy, subscribe, and turn on notifications. James Henderson stood at his kitchen window, absently stirring his morning coffee as he gazed out at the well-manicured lawn of his suburban home. At 65, retirement had settled into a comfortable routine. Breakfast at 7, a stroll through the neighborhood at 8, and the crossword puzzle by 9. Today, however, would prove to be anything but routine. The distant rumble of the mail truck caught his attention. James watched as the familiar blue and white vehicle made its way down Maple Street, pausing briefly at each mailbox. He sipped his coffee, savoring the rich aroma and the quiet moment before the day truly began. Little did he know that this ordinary Tuesday was about to take an extraordinary turn. As the mail truck pulled away from his driveway, James noticed something unusual. Instead of the regular stack of bills and advertisements, a sizable brown package rested in his mailbox. Curiosity piqued. He set down his mug and made his way to the front door, his slippered feet shuffling across the hardwood floors. The cool morning air greeted him as he stepped onto the porch. James reached into the mailbox, his fingers closing around the unexpected parcel. It was heavier than he anticipated, and as he turned it over in his hands, he searched for a return address. There was none. Just his name and address, written in an unfamiliar hand. Back inside, James placed the package on his kitchen table, eyeing it warily. In all his years, he'd learned that surprises weren't always pleasant. His mind raced with possibilities. A belated birthday gift from a forgetful friend, perhaps? Or something more sinister? With a deep breath, he decided to finish his coffee before tackling the mystery. Some things, he mused, were better faced with a clear head and steady hands. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 9 times as James finally gathered the courage to open the package. With trembling fingers, he carefully peeled back the brown paper, revealing a simple cardboard box beneath. He paused, his heart racing with a mix of anticipation and apprehension. Whatever lay inside, he sensed, would disrupt the tranquil life he'd carefully constructed over the past decades. Lifting the lid, James gasped. A flood of memories washed over him as he beheld the contents. A stack of old photographs, their edges worn and colors faded with time. On top lay a sealed envelope, his name written in a script he hadn't seen in years, but would recognize anywhere. Michael. His younger brother's handwriting hadn't changed a bit. With shaking hands, James lifted the first photograph. It was a snapshot from a summer long past. 2 young boys, arms slung over each other's shoulders, grinning widely at the camera. The older boy, gangly and freckled, was unmistakably James himself. And the younger one, with a mischievous glint in his eye, was Michael. They stood in front of their childhood home, a modest 2-story house with peeling white paint and a red front door. As he sifted through the photos, scenes from his youth played out before him. Family picnics in the park, Christmas mornings around a twinkling tree, fishing trips with their father. Each image stirred long-buried emotions, joy, nostalgia, and a deep, aching sadness. James hadn't spoken to Michael in over 20 years, their relationship fractured by a series of misunderstandings and hurt feelings that had seemed insurmountable at the time. Setting aside the photos, James turned his attention to the envelope. It felt weighty in his hands, as if it contained more than just paper, perhaps the weight of unspoken words and lost years. He debated whether to open it, torn between the desire to protect his carefully cultivated peace and the undeniable pull of curiosity. After a long moment, he made his decision. With a deep breath, he broke the seal and unfolded the letter inside. "Dear James," the letter began, the familiar handwriting bringing a lump to his throat. "I hope this package finds you well. It's been far too long, and I know that's largely my fault." James paused, taken aback by the immediate admission. He'd always assumed Michael blamed him for their estrangement. With a steadying breath, he continued reading, his brother's words painting a picture of regret and hope. Michael went on to explain how he'd been trying to reach out for years, but shame and fear had held him back. He wrote of sleepless nights spent composing letters never sent, of driving past James's house without the courage to knock on the door. "I've made so many mistakes," Michael confessed, "but none greater than letting our relationship crumble. I miss my big brother James. I miss the way we used to be." As James read on, he learned of the life Michael had built in the intervening years, a modest success as a small business owner, a marriage that had ended amicably, and the joy of fatherhood. Through it all, Michael wrote, he'd carried the weight of their unresolved conflict. "I've told my daughter so many stories about her Uncle James," the letter said, "and it breaks my heart that she's never met you. I want to change that, if you'll let me." Tears blurred James's vision as he reached the final paragraphs. Michael had included his phone number and address, along with a heartfelt plea for reconciliation. "I know I have no right to ask this of you," he wrote, "but I'm hoping that the bond we once shared still means something. If you're willing, I'd like to try and rebuild what we've lost. It's never too late for a new beginning, is it?" James set the letter down, his mind reeling. The carefully constructed walls he'd built around his heart over the years began to crumble. He glanced at the clock. It was barely past 10, yet he felt as if he'd lived a lifetime since breakfast. As he sat there, surrounded by memories and faced with an unexpected chance at reconciliation, James realized that his quiet, predictable life had been irrevocably changed. The question now was, what would he do about it? Certainly. I'll continue with the next 3 chapters of the story, maintaining the same structure and style. James spent the rest of the morning in a daze, Michael's letter clutched in his hand as he paced the length of his living room. The ticking of the grandfather clock seemed to grow louder with each pass, a constant reminder of the years that had slipped away. He found himself pausing before the mantelpiece, studying the few family photos he'd allowed himself to keep on display. One in particular caught his eye, a picture of himself and Michael at James's college graduation. They stood side by side, James in his cap and gown, Michael beaming with pride. It was one of the last happy memories James had of their relationship before everything fell apart. He reached out, touching the frame gently, as if he could reach through time and warn his younger self of the storm to come. The rift had started small, as these things often do. A missed birthday here, an unanswered phone call there. James had been building his career as a teacher, pouring himself into his work, while Michael struggled to find his path. Misunderstandings piled up like bricks in a wall, until one Thanksgiving dinner erupted into a shouting match that left both brothers hurt and angry. Pride had kept James from reaching out in the aftermath. He'd told himself that Michael was the one who needed to apologize, to make amends. As weeks turned to months, and months to years, it became easier to nurture the grudge than to face the pain of reconciliation. Now, faced with Michael's heartfelt plea, James felt the weight of his own culpability settling on his shoulders. With a heavy sigh, James sank into his armchair, the letter still in his hands. He closed his eyes, memories washing over him, the good and the bad, the laughter and the tears. As the morning light streamed through the windows, James realized he had a choice to make. He could continue down the path of isolation, or he could take a chance on rebuilding the relationship he'd once cherished above all others. The decision, he knew, would change everything. By afternoon, James had made up his mind. He would respond to Michael's letter, but first, he needed to know more. Setting aside his usual routine, he booted up the old desktop computer in his study, fingers hovering uncertainly over the keyboard. It had been years since he'd used the internet for anything more complex than checking the weather or reading the news. With determination, James typed his brother's name into the search engine. The results were overwhelming. Social media profiles, business listings, and news articles scrolled across the screen. He clicked on a link to a small business website, and there was Michael, smiling confidently in a photo beneath the About Us section. James's heart clenched at the sight of his brother's familiar features, now lined with age. Encouraged by this small success, James dug deeper. He found mentions of Michael in local newspaper articles, praising his contributions to community projects. There were photos of charity golf tournaments and ribbon-cutting ceremonies. It seemed Michael had become quite the pillar of his community. James felt a mix of pride and regret. Pride in his brother's accomplishments, and regret for the years he'd missed. As the afternoon wore on, James's search led him to a Facebook page. Though he'd never used the platform himself, he navigated to Michael's profile. It was mostly private, but a few public posts showed glimpses of Michael's life. A photo of him with a young woman who must be his daughter, snapshots of family barbecues and holiday gatherings. James felt like a voyeur, peering into a life he should have been part of. Overwhelmed by the flood of information and emotion, James shut down the computer. He'd learned enough to know that Michael's letter had been sincere, that his brother's life seemed full and meaningful. But questions still lingered, and James knew that to truly move forward, he would need to do more than just online research. With a deep breath, he picked up the phone, fingers hovering over the keypad as he prepared to make a call he never thought he'd make. The phone rang 3 times before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" James hesitated for a moment before responding. "Martha, it's James Henderson." There was a pause on the other end, then a warm exclamation of surprise. Martha Johnson had been a fixture in the Henderson brothers' lives since childhood, a neighbor and friend who had watched them grow up. If anyone could provide insight into Michael's life over the past 2 decades, it would be her. "James, what a wonderful surprise!" Martha's voice crackled with excitement. "It's been far too long. How are you, dear?" James found himself smiling despite his nervousness. Martha's warmth had always had that effect on him. They exchanged pleasantries for a few minutes before James steered the conversation to the real reason for his call. "Martha, I've received a letter from Michael," he said hesitantly. "I was hoping you might be able to tell me a bit about how he's been." There was a moment of silence on the other end of the line, and James could almost picture Martha's thoughtful expression. When she spoke again, her voice was gentle but firm. "Oh, James," she sighed. "I've been hoping for years that you two would find your way back to each other. Michael's been through a lot, but he's never stopped talking about you, you know. Always asking if I'd heard anything. Always hoping." As Martha began to fill in the gaps of Michael's life, James listened intently, scribbling notes on a nearby notepad. She told him of Michael's struggles and triumphs, of his divorce and the birth of his daughter, of his efforts to build a successful business from the ground up. With each revelation, James felt the wall he'd built around his heart crumble a little more. "He's a good man, James," Martha concluded, her voice thick with emotion. "He's made mistakes, sure, but haven't we all? I think he could really use his big brother right about now." James thanked Martha for her insights, promising to keep in touch. As he hung up the phone, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. The path forward was becoming clearer, but it wouldn't be an easy journey. With a deep breath, James began to plan his next move. "Certainly. I'll continue with the next 3 chapters of the story, maintaining the same structure and style." The decision to meet Michael face-to-face didn't come easily to James. For days after his conversation with Martha, he wrestled with doubt and anxiety. He'd stand before the mirror, rehearsing what he might say, only to shake his head and walk away. The letter and photos lay on his bedside table, a constant reminder of the choice he faced. One morning, as James sipped his coffee on the back porch, watching the sun rise over his neighbor's fence, he came to a realization. The fear he felt wasn't just about confronting Michael. It was about confronting himself. He'd spent years building a life of comfortable solitude, and reaching out to his brother meant admitting that something had been missing all along. With trembling hands, James picked up his phone and dialed the number Michael had provided in the letter. Each ring seemed to last an eternity. When Michael's voice finally came through, tentative and hopeful, James felt his throat constrict. "Michael," he managed. "It's James. I think it's time we talked." The relief in his brother's voice was palpable, and they quickly arranged to meet the following weekend. The days leading up to the meeting passed in a blur of nervous energy. James found himself pulling out old photo albums, reacquainting himself with the brother he'd once known so well. He wondered how much Michael had changed, and how much had stayed the same. Would they still share the same sense of humor? Would the years of separation have created an unbridgeable gap? As the day of the meeting dawned, James stood before his closet, deliberating over what to wear as if he were preparing for a first date rather than a reunion with his brother. In the end, he chose a simple blue button-down shirt, Michael's favorite color, he remembered with a pang. With one last look in the mirror, James grabbed his keys and headed out the door, his heart pounding with a mixture of fear and anticipation. The cafe where they agreed to meet was a small, cozy place on the outskirts of town. James arrived early, choosing a quiet corner table where he could watch the door. His fingers drummed nervously on the tabletop as he waited, eyes darting to the entrance with each chime of the bell above the door. And then, suddenly, there he was. Michael stood in the doorway, looking older and yet achingly familiar. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. James rose slowly from his seat, his legs feeling unsteady beneath him. Michael approached, a hesitant smile on his face. "James," he said softly, "it's good to see you." The brothers stood awkwardly for a moment before Michael stepped forward, enveloping James in a tight hug. James stiffened at first, then gradually relaxed into the embrace, feeling the years of separation melt away. When they finally pulled apart, both men had tears in their eyes. They sat down, an uncomfortable silence settling between them as they struggled to find the right words. James cleared his throat. "You look well," he said, wincing inwardly at the banality of the statement. Michael nodded, his smile tinged with sadness. "You too," he replied. "I wasn't sure you'd come." The honesty in his voice broke something open in James's chest. "I wasn't sure either," he admitted. "But I'm glad I did." With those simple words, the tension began to ease, and they found themselves slipping into conversation more easily. As they talked, sipping coffee and sharing memories, James felt a warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the hot beverage. There was still much to discuss, hurts to address and explanations to be made. But for now, it was enough to simply be in each other's presence again. The road to reconciliation would be long, James knew. But as he looked at his brother's familiar face across the table, he felt for the first time in years that he was exactly where he needed to be. As the afternoon wore on, James and Michael's conversation deepened, moving beyond surface pleasantries to the heart of their estrangement. "I'm sorry," Michael said suddenly, his voice thick with emotion. "I should have tried harder to reach out sooner." James shook his head, feeling the weight of his own regrets. "We both made mistakes," he replied. "I was too proud, too stubborn to make the first move." They began to unravel the knot of misunderstandings and hurt feelings that had driven them apart. Michael spoke of his struggles with self-doubt and the shadow of James's success, while James confessed to his own feelings of guilt for not being more supportive. Each revelation was like a balm, soothing old wounds and paving the way for healing. As they talked, James was struck by how much Michael had changed, and yet how much he remained the same. The mischievous glint in his eye was still there, though tempered now by wisdom and experience. James found himself laughing at Michael's jokes, remembering the easy camaraderie they'd once shared. It wasn't all laughter, though. There were moments of tension, old hurts resurfacing, but they pushed through, committed to the process of rebuilding their relationship. Michael pulled out his phone, showing James pictures of his daughter, Sarah. "She's always wanted to meet her Uncle James," he said softly. James felt a pang of regret for the years he'd missed, but also a surge of hope for the future. "I'd like that," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "To meet her, I mean." Michael's smile was bright enough to light up the room. As the sun began to set outside the cafe window, James realized they'd been talking for hours. Yet it felt like no time at all had passed. There was still so much to say, so much to catch up on, but they had made a start. As they stood to leave, Michael hesitated, then pulled James into another hug. "Thank you," he whispered, "for giving me a second chance." James hugged him back tightly, feeling a sense of peace he hadn't known in years. "Thank you for not giving up on me," he replied. "Certainly. I'll continue with the final chapter and epilogue, maintaining the same structure and style." In the weeks that followed their cafe reunion, James and Michael fell into a rhythm of regular phone calls and weekend visits. Each interaction brought them closer, bridging the gap that years of silence had created. James found himself looking forward to their conversations, his once predictable routine now pleasantly disrupted by his rekindled relationship with his brother. During one of Michael's visits, they decided to go through old family photo albums together. Sitting side by side on James's worn leather couch, they laughed and reminisced over faded snapshots of their youth. "Remember this camping trip?" Michael asked, pointing to a photo of them as teenagers, standing proudly next to a lopsided tent. James chuckled. "How could I forget? That was the trip where you insisted you knew how to start a fire without matches." As they continued to flip through the pages, the conversation turned to their parents. "I wish they could see us now," Michael said softly. James nodded, feeling a mix of sadness and gratitude. "They would have been happy," he replied, placing a comforting hand on his brother's shoulder. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke volumes about how far they'd come. The sound of laughter drew their attention to the kitchen, where Michael's daughter Sarah was attempting to bake cookies with James's help. It had taken some time, but Sarah and James had developed a warm relationship, bonding over their shared love of literature and terrible puns. Watching them together, Michael felt a sense of completeness he hadn't experienced in years. As the day drew to a close, James and Michael stood on the front porch, reluctant to say goodbye. "Same time next week?" Michael asked, a hint of uncertainty in his voice. James smiled, pulling his brother into a hug. "Wouldn't miss it for the world," he replied. As he watched Michael's car disappear down the street, James felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unexpected package that had changed everything. 1 year after the arrival of the mysterious package, the Henderson brothers stood side by side in James's backyard, surrounded by friends and family. The occasion was a dual celebration: James's retirement and Michael's birthday. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and the smell of barbecue as their two worlds, once separate, merged into one. James watched with a smile as Sarah regaled a group of his former colleagues with stories of her latest adventures. He caught Michael's eye across the yard, and they shared a knowing look. The road to reconciliation hadn't always been smooth, but every bump and detour had been worth it to reach this moment of harmony. As the party wound down and guests began to depart, James and Michael found themselves alone on the patio. "You know," Michael said, a mischievous glint in his eye, "I found some old maps in Dad's things. I was thinking maybe we could take a road trip, revisit some of our old haunts." James laughed, feeling a surge of excitement at the prospect. "That sounds perfect," he replied, "though this time, I'm in charge of navigation." They clinked their glasses together, toasting to new beginnings and rediscovered brotherhood. As the sun set on another day, James reflected on how a single package had set in motion a chain of events that had enriched his life beyond measure. He realized that it's never too late for second chances, for healing, for love. And as he looked at his brother, he knew that the best chapters of their story were yet to be written. With the warm glow of contentment surrounding them, James and Michael began to plan their next adventure, eager to make up for lost time and create new memories together. I really hope you enjoyed the story. Please leave a comment with your views. I'm sure there will be new videos on this channel that will thrill you. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, give it a like, and activate the notification bell so you don't miss our next videos. Until next time.